Next up is the Director of Water Policy for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. That would be Kathy Baskin. Hi, Kathy. You're supposed to applaud that. Thank you.
Also, tell you a little bit about what's going on in terms of water and Massachusetts. So we heard a lot about flooding from Brian and temperature changes. So we're expecting in the future that we'll have temperature changes of several degrees higher, especially in the winter. We're expecting somewhere between 1 and 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That's hard to plan for. My office today has been looking at ways to incorporate climate change into our environmental review process that looks at very large projects and asks the question of developers, what will happen under climate change and how are you prepared? But we can't really tell them what to plan for. Are we telling them to plan for 1 foot or 6 feet of sea level rise? In terms of precipitation, there's been a lot of talk around rainfall, the 100-year event, and that storm that's got a 1% chance of occurring each year. And what does that look like? So the 100-year storm today, the official one, and I know some of you are actively looking at this right now, is 6.5 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. But the Northeast Regional Climate Center, which is up in Cornell, was hired by one branch of our federal government to take a look at the new data. And let's update since 1961. Let's see if there have been any changes. And they found that the 100-year, 24-hour storm is 8.5 inches. So that's an increase of about 30% or so, going from 6.5 to 8.5 inches. The other thing about precipitation is that another branch of the federal government that doesn't talk to the first branch of the federal government is updating the official 100-year storm. So that's NOAA. So we have the branch of the federal government that couldn't wait for NOAA. And so it looks like from a draft report that NOAA has put out, which will be published final in 2015, that our 100-year storm that happens over a 24-hour period will be around 8 inches. It will depend on what town you're in and what part of the state, but somewhere between 7.5 and a little bit over 8 inches. So for sure we know we're dealing with more water. That's for today. Going into the future, our scientists, and this is using the National Climate Assessment, they can't tell you to anything less than a 24-hour event how much more rain we're going to get. They don't know. Their models can't tell us. So they're slapping on factors. Bump it up by this much. So we think, but we don't know. It might be 9, 10 inches around there for a 100-year storm going out at the end of the century. It could be more. But the bottom line is we're expecting more frequent storms and more rain when it's delivered. But then you hear, oh, what about droughts? So we're going to have droughts too. The reason that we're expecting droughts is because of the temperature. Not because, oh, and then it will stop raining for a while. No, it's going to be scorching hot. And we're going to have more rain. And we're going to have higher sea level. So that's the scenario. Okay. This is all ancient history, right? We've been living with this sea level rise, about 10 inches in the last several decades. Here's what we think we're going to get in the future, and I just reviewed a lot of that already, but that has some consequences. So for example, people think, oh, thank goodness it won't snow as much, I won't have to shovel. Well, maybe not. It might be that heavy back-breaking snow, or it might be something that translates into a nice ice storm that takes down our power lines for a couple weeks. So, it's not for sure that we'll get relief and have a lovely climate or anything like that in the winter. So I did talk a lot about projected precipitation, and let's add that to what we're already doing as a society, which is building, developing, paving. So when you take these things together and you add more water over an impervious surface, you're going to compound the problem in a way. So our rivers, for example, expect that water to go into the ground and then flow underground to the river for base flow in the summer. So when we're not getting the rain, that's its IV unit, really. It's not always just what is falling from the sky at the moment. And that will be cut off, but then we'll have these extreme flood events. So if the precipitation hits the impervious surface, collects all at once, rushes across the driveway or a parking lot and into a pipe and into a river, you get these spiky peak flows that cause a lot of damage. We heard that the city of Boston is looking at their vehicles, for example, and can they move through certain elevations of water. And I remember Somerville lost 18 vehicles, 18 police cars that were in its parking lot during a very large flood event. So definitely, as we're seeing the changing climate, we definitely have to consider what's already on the ground and how can we help situation. Okay. So I'll just talk a little bit about what the state's role is and a little bit about the community and how we can work together. So we are in the process of looking at state infrastructure. I have a couple slides which I'm not sure I'll have time for, but MWRA, for example, is looking at, not only they know that the Deer Island treatment plant is built high enough, but they've been doing evaluations of all their facilities to see what might be at risk under certain conditions. And then as these facilities are rehabilitated over the next 20 years or so, they'll put those, they'll make sure that they're designed in a way, it might just be a special door that blocks water, or it may be a real reconfiguration of how that system, that part of the system works. But that'll be incorporated into the design. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation is looking at all of its critical assets, starting with the central artery. So we just spent $14 billion in 20 years to build the central artery, and really the first big study is to see what will happen under an extreme sea level rise or coastal surge event. But that kind of thinking is at DOT, and they're looking at all of their critical facilities. So we're in the process of developing models. There's a model that's bouncing around from city to agency to, it's getting better and better. So one place is using it and configuring it for its purposes, passing it over to another. These models are available for communities to pick up and adapt and use for their own purposes. Let's keep going. A couple of projects that I'll highlight that the state's involved in. We're involved in a lot of things. A couple of things that relate to communities, though. We have some grants around coastal resiliency, green infrastructure, or using nature as an ally. Rather than putting everything into a pipe and sending it on its way, maybe finding ways to get the water to percolate into the ground, for example, or using a man-made dune as protection rather than a seawall. We're hiring a state climatologist. So that's a really big step forward for Massachusetts, although we're just catching up to the rest of the country, really. And he's somebody who not only will be collecting information and doing research, but interacting with the public and interacting with the municipalities. So if they have questions about what the science is telling us, he can help interpret that. Oh, another thing that we're doing is LiDAR. So that is when folks are in a plane, they shoot lasers down to the ground to get an accurate reading of what the topography looks like, so that they have a really good idea of where, if there is sea level rise or coastal surge or riverine flooding, where that's going to land on the surface. And public health, Suzanne Condon's here. She's going to tell you, I think DPH has probably done the best job in terms of getting to each of the communities in their outreach. I'm going to keep going and talk about communities and what communities can do. And I'll give you a few examples. And I think the biggest thing is to learn from each other. And there are some leaders, Cambridge and Boston have the resources and they have been able to pave the way, but the Metro Mayors Summit that Mayor Walsh has proposed is an excellent model that other communities, say in the Middlesex County region, could emulate. So where you have some common issues and getting together in a group to help identify things that can't be done just at the individual municipal scale. That's really an important thing. And also helping to pay for certain resources in the same way that you may pay for a shared public health official. You can also be looking at studies or joint projects that help manage the water or cool areas. So that's something. The other thing is there's another, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council is releasing a report soon. They've done a vulnerability assessment for their 101 communities in eastern Massachusetts, which includes Middlesex County. And they have a lot of terrific suggestions. It's overwhelming when you look at a report, and I know I was involved in the Massachusetts climate change report, to look at 300 suggestions, but really if you're focusing on those few that you can tackle and you feel like will make the biggest difference, that's probably the place to start. So using your neighbors as mentors and allies, and then looking at things. There are folks that are already involved in working with your local hospitals, for example, your other vulnerable populations, working on land conservation, making sure that you have cooling centers. So these are things these are very sort of smaller scale things that individual communities committees in a community can work on. Do we know about our cooling center? Is it going to work if there's a power failure? What are we going to do with these people here who live in this type of housing or this type of need this type of medical care? And I think I've talked enough about what our neighbors are doing. And then you could get clever and offer incentives and direct certain outcomes in a way that you want them to occur. So for example, the town of Hull has, where no town in the Commonwealth is allowed to come up with a building ordinance that goes above and beyond the state building code, they can provide incentives. They can push folks or encourage folks to go in a certain direction. So the town of Hull has incorporated a free board incentive where it gives a rebate on a building permit if folks elevate their structures up a couple feet. I thought this was a great little feature, it's hard to see in this light, but that's a subway vent in New York City that's also a bench and an interesting art piece of art on the sidewalk. So there are very small things that people can do and very large things that people can do, and there's really a role for all of us. Okay, and I think I will leave it there. This just shows some of the MWRA facilities, but I want to thank you again, and I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Kathy, don't go away. Thank you. 1 second. About several months ago, I can't remember when the governor spends an hour with us on the radio in the studio, someone called to yell at him for all those international junkets that allegedly produce nothing. And one of the examples he gave to counter the charge was he talked about going to Israel. I don't know if it was the first or second time, and about with mass technology firms. I think I'm going to get this right. If not, you'll know what I'm talking about. Coordinating this global clean water initiative, and in fact some Israeli firms have already moved to Newton, I think, that deal with clean water. Could you give us the short version of what was achieved there?
Sure. So he was in Israel talking about his clean energy, and there was a guy in the front row saying, "Hey, what about water? Hey, what about water?" And so the governor came back and said, "Yeah, what about water? Let's look at it," and started or encouraged the development of the New England Water Innovation Network, which is a network of researchers at our universities, venture capitalists who can help get an idea off the ground and really get some traction there, consultants who might find a place in their design for this new technology, utilities like the MWRA who might be the ultimate end user of that technology. And we're looking to become a hotbed for water innovation in this area. We think we have, I think there are 600 different companies or organizations that are engaged in water, and we think that this is like biotech or clean energy, that this is a really good opportunity for the Commonwealth to shine and bring in some new jobs. So
thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Up next is a woman who has been at DPH, Department of Public Health, for 30 years. I'm sure she's really tired, and she came anyway. She's the Associate Commissioner and Director of the Bureau of Environmental Health at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. That would be Suzanne Condon. Suzanne, welcome.
So thank you to Fred Yen and Sustainable Middlesex. It's great to be able to come out here on a Saturday morning and talk a little bit about some of what we've been doing with municipalities across the state. And I thank Kathy Baskin for her kind words about DPH's efforts. We do work with 351 local health officials across the state, and that is a challenge, but it's because of the opportunities to get to come out to forums like this and work directly with the public that I think I've stayed those 30 years at the Department of Public Health. So let's see, I've watched my colleagues enough now. So I'm nothing if not compulsive about organization. And so I just quickly tell you that I want to talk briefly about climate and health in Massachusetts. A CDC, a federal grant that we've gotten from the Centers for Disease Control we've had it now for several years. A local public health survey that we did to really give us a picture of what level of preparedness our local health officials are at in terms of dealing with climate effects. The development of tools that we've been working on to assist local municipalities across the state. And then I think Fred asked all of us to touch a little bit on what some of you could do to help move us forward in terms of being better prepared. So I'll just briefly mention some work that Kathy Baskin actually led for us at the state level, and that was following Governor Patrick's signing of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Many of us got right to work on trying to address those very large, scary issues that each of us were going to have to worry about from where we sat in our seats in government. And for public health, we were fortunate to co-chair the Human Health and Welfare Committee, and then ended up taking the lead with our partners at DEP in drafting that section of the final adaptation report. And so in public health, we worry about things like air quality, water quality, agriculture and food systems, and vulnerable populations. I'm going to touch on some of these issues a little bit more in a minute, so I won't go into detail here. The kinds of things that we worry about in terms of health impacts are things like increased heat stress, respiratory and heart disease, a rise in those rates, elevated levels of ozone and particulate matter because they will impact cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease, higher pollen counts, again, respiratory disease, increased vector-borne diseases. Some of you may be aware that in the past couple of years, for the first time ever, we've seen West Nile virus and Eastern equine encephalitis in the western part of our state. We never even did surveillance out there. So here we have it. I think more outbreaks of waterborne diseases, degraded surface water quality, which can impact drinking water supplies, bacterial contamination impacting shellfish. Jim mentioned earlier that it's all about stories. And I've been talking with folks across this state about stories and how people are impacted. So if you don't live near the water and you're not a harvester of oysters, then you probably might think that you're not impacted by something that I had to do for the first time ever in the 30 years that I've worked at the Department of Public Health, and that was to close down oyster beds in our state because of Vibrio parahemolyticus contamination. That term rolls off my tongue today. 4 years ago, Vibrio vulnificus and parahemolyticus was something that I didn't really have to practice a lot. But we saw the number of cases more than triple over a 2-year period, causing us to issue those closures last year. This happens as a result of people consuming raw oysters that are taken from areas where the waters are warming and the bacteria is rising. The stories are really about people who are impacted. I had a man in his 40s in tears begging me not to close those oyster beds. His wife had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. She was out of work. If he was out of work, they couldn't pay their rent and they couldn't afford to care for their children. And it was heart-wrenching. So it caused me to think more about how to better prepare communities and how to better warn the public about these risks so we're not having high-risk people consume those contaminated oysters and cause the government to shut down oyster beds. I think similarly, we think about extreme weather events, and we've all talked about that, the flooding, etc. Something I had to do several months after Hurricane Sandy was to issue a warning to the public, warning them to be wary of big 5-gallon bottled water jugs that many people use in their homes. People were using them in New York to store gasoline, and they don't get really well cleaned. They are recycled. They thought they did a great job, the bottled water folks in New York, by warning people that if you use this to store gasoline for your generator, then you will not get your refund when we go to collect the bottle. So what do you think that did to people? They didn't tell anyone. So several months later, I get a call after midnight on a Friday night, it's always after midnight on a Friday night, from a local emergency room where a young infant was violently ill because that infant's mother used that bottled water to mix formula. So I think that it is all about the stories and trying to make this stuff real for people so that they connect the dots. So in 2010, DPH was tasked with doing a statewide survey. We wanted to find out how prepared are our local health officials across the state. So we developed a survey that would elicit information on perceptions of climate change related to health risks and capacity to address those risks, community characteristics, and then baseline operations, emergency planning, and community communication systems. We had about a 65% response rate statewide, which isn't too bad. I'm happy to say that certain areas of the state, including in this region, we had a much higher response rate. So where Middlesex County sits about 76% response rate. So here's what, I just selected a few things, but I would encourage you to go on our website, and I'll show you a slide on that later. You can find out what Middlesex communities participated and what the outcome was specific to every one of a series of questions. So when it came to preparing for the public health effects of climate change and whether or not it was identified, this area has been identified as an important area of focus for local health. Most parts of the state, nearly 70%, said no, it hadn't really been identified as something to worry about. That's a little scary when we think about all those communities. But in Middlesex, we had about an equal number of participating local health departments say that they did or didn't agree that they were prepared, but that, still hovering around 50%. Folks have not been looking at this. Kathy, I think, talked about some resources that have been expended in these areas, but whether or not the community has adequate resources, we fared a little bit better in Middlesex County than the state as a whole, but not a whole lot better. Only 30% believe they have adequate resources to deal with this. Similarly, whether they believe that their local health department staff has the expertise to deal with the effects of climate change, not a whole lot. About 30% really believe that they have the skill sets necessary to really dig in and start preparing. This is one that Kathy mentioned that I've been barking about, I think, for a while, because I think a lot of our local public health folks have been doing a lot of work, certainly with the CDC and then state trickle-down bioterrorism funding that we've all gotten. So they've got better preparedness plans for a range of emergencies. But here's one that bothers me. So the knowledge of the percentage of homes with air conditioning, only about 25% of Middlesex local health departments know how many people have air conditioning. That's important because if you have to move people that have respiratory conditions or other chronic disease to cooling centers, you need to know where they are. So that plan has to get better. And here's another one, knowledge of air conditioning availability in schools. In Middlesex, we fare better than the state, about 65% versus 50%. But again, what's scary about this is if you're going to be moving people that have respiratory disease out of their home because they don't have air conditioning, you can't bring them to a place that's not air-cooled. They won't do better. Here's one that I think reinforces what I just said, that there are plans in place, and there has been capacity built, certainly in the area of storms and water and foodborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, food safety and security. Lots of those plans are well along in many municipalities across the state because of the federal funds that we've been able to use. But here's what's very scary to me, both in Middlesex County and across the state. If you look at those second two bars, diabetes and asthma and breathing disorders, there's no program in place. Very few programs in place to help people that have chronic disease or respiratory disease, certainly people with heart disease and people with disabilities. These are the folks that are going to be most impacted. We need to know where they are, and we need to develop plans so that we can better help people when the need arises. So this is a little encouraging. That more Middlesex communities than the statewide average know when they're going to be planning to open cooling centers, and they have location and operational hours of cooling centers, but I think we still have a ways to go there. So highlights of capacity in areas in need for enhancement. There is an overall belief that local health departments statewide are unprepared and under-resourced or lack the expertise to adequately respond to extreme weather events. In Middlesex County communities, about 30% believe they have adequate resources or expertise to deal with climate change. And while Middlesex County communities indicated their community had some initiatives in place to mitigate the impacts of climate change, there's a need to coordinate local government officials and better integrate local public health and planning, preparedness, and adaptation strategies based on follow-up discussions with local health officials. People have to work together. I think Kathy touched on this and Brian touched on this. The Conservation Commission, the local planning and development, DPW, they all have to be talking to local health because everything they're going to be doing impacts what each other is doing or needs to do. More than 70% of participating local boards of health in Middlesex County communities had plans or felt they had the capacity to develop plans to address storm responses and waterborne and foodborne diseases. However, plans for populations that might be most impacted by climate effects need further attention. About 70% of local boards of health in Middlesex that responded to the survey believe they have adequate resources. Only 26% of local boards of health in Middlesex County communities are aware of air conditioning availability in residences and about 65% in schools. About 60 to 70% of responding local boards of health in Middlesex have plans or were drafting plans for cooling centers in the event of heat waves. I won't go into too much detail. I think these slides are going to be posted somewhere at the county level. But this is a great series of steps that we've been taking to enhance preparedness and capacity for local community people across the state. This is our public health tracking portal. I would encourage you to go on there. There's all kinds of information available, and we even have one of these leaves is focused completely on climate change, climate effects. We're promoting the use of health impact assessments and actually have been working with Kathy and her folks too on how to best incorporate looking at health impact as it relates to climate change. And we'll be having more regional meetings. Just a few things that you can think about for what you can do if you're a resident of Middlesex. So we know there are higher temperatures and poor air quality will contribute to exacerbation of respiratory and cardiovascular disease. People can help local officials promote the development of heat warning plans that target athletes, outdoor workers, and children. Ensure that there are adequate cooling center availability in place at shelters. We know there'll be changes in disease patterns and increased risk of vector-borne disease. For that reason, we need to enhance surveillance of vector-borne diseases. We need to improve the capacity to respond to outbreak, and we need to consider community-based outreach aimed at education about risks and prevention. A lot of communities have stopped doing athletic events after dusk in high-risk areas in our state. The rest of the state needs to learn why that's important. And then stress on public and private healthcare systems from increased occurrence and demand for treatment of acute chronic impacts. I think state, regional, and local officials need to incorporate these climate vulnerabilities into existing plans by identifying vulnerable populations. These data are not collected at any level, but they could be. And local community residents could work with local officials on that. I won't get into the rest of this. There's certainly, I would say this final bullet here, establish interdepartmental teams across elected officials and planners and health officials to address the need for adequate resources. So in summary, local health departments in Middlesex have made significant progress in preparing for and responding to public health emergencies. However, plans in Middlesex and in other areas of the state do need significant enhancements. Capacity assessment data and other information from DPH will help identify areas where enhancements to planning are warranted. And I think DPH will continue to provide technical assistance through website enhancements to further these efforts and to continue to work with community folks like yourselves and our local health partners across the state. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Suzanne. Just so we can get to the Q&A, I'm going to hold my questions until we start with yours. And again, those cards, I assume, are circulating around the room. Two more presenters, and then they will all take to the stage to take your questions. Next is the Senior Vice President of Network Strategies for National Grid. She is Marie Jordon. Please welcome her.
You know, epic events have a way of making change, and Hurricane Sandy was no exception. When Hurricane Sandy hit the eastern seaboard, 8.5 million businesses and homes lost their power. And there was a tremendous amount of revenue that took as an impact on our economy. It's really surprising the economic impact of outages, as Brian shared with us. And 140,000 customers lost gas service. Now, this was the largest natural gas historical event of damage by any storm, which is surprising because you don't necessarily think about the natural gas system being impacted by a hurricane. It was a learning experience for us as well. And when you look at what these severe impacts of these storms are, Connect 21, the bottom one right there. Yeah, thank you. So when you think about the damage that these storms are doing and the rate at which we're seeing these, it's pretty alarming. So if you look at, the Munich Reinsurance Group did a study, and between 1980 and 2011, there's been a 500% increase in storm events in North America. Significant storm events. That's a huge number. So if we look at what are our current challenges today, and when we think about our energy networks, these were hailed by the National Academy of Engineering as the marvel of the 20th century. Today, the grid is not doing what we need to. It doesn't have the two-way communication. We have a growing interdependency on gas as well. It's the other energy grid, as we found out in Hurricane Sandy. And we think about the complex challenges. A few of the warts that we have on our system is really, it's old. It's an incredibly old system built on a regulatory infrastructure building type process that it hasn't been reestablished. And it's inefficient. There's a tremendous amount of loss in the way we generate our energy to the point where we use it. Believe it or not, over 50% of the energy generated either by the electric system or by the gas shale fields to burner tip, over 50% of that energy is lost in transit. That's a tremendous number. So if you think about it, our energy system needs about $2.5 trillion of investment. But if we can capture half of that energy loss, 50% of that loss that we have, we can save $327 million. So there's a lot to be said about how we do our energy, how we use our energy, where we generate it, how we build these microgrids, how we start using it differently. There's a savings there that's going to help translate in how we invest. And how do we do that? So if you think about it, the $327 billion that we could invest will generate 1.3 million jobs and create that same savings. So if we look at our challenges today, how we regulate our industry, I touched on that briefly. When you have to do this infrastructure the way we've done it, the infrastructure has a model on investment that promotes that capital investment, just the pouring of the capital dollars into the system and how we recover. We have to change that paradigm. We have to think differently about how we're rewarded in this industry, how we're rewarded for our investment, for the risks we take, how we partner with the technology companies. Because our system is designed to deliver energy one way. It was never designed for that two-way interaction. It was never designed to reach out and bring in the renewables and have those microgrids and during an event be able to isolate areas and shut it down to protect the grid. We didn't build it that way. We built it for the generation to be way outside the communities in which we live, come in on high voltage transmission lines, and then be distributed amongst your city. But how do we do it differently? And there's ways we can do and partner and change that paradigm and really make a difference in the investment. So when we start to improve the energy efficiency and actual security on the system, that's becoming more of a challenge as we have all these different technologies that are helping advance the grid. Those are also points at which we're vulnerable. And when we look at the innovative technologies, are the utilities really the right ones to be thinking about the innovation in technology? Or should we do it through partnerships? You know, when you look at Google Nest, when you look at the products that they're bringing to the table, does that change the way we need to do smart meters? Do we really need to have the utility invest in a piece of technology at every home with the level of interface that we should have today to have you interact with your system? Or should we leave that to our IT partners? So it's got to be a different way that we look at doing this. So our opportunity. So when we look at the regulation of the industry and the partnering of the technology and putting our customers in charge, that last one's really important because there's different ways people want to interact with us. We're doing the smart grid in Worcester right now, and in that smart grid demonstration project, even before we launched it, we brought in over 300 people from Worcester into a 2-day summit and asked the businesses, the low income, the residential, all parts of Worcester on how they want to deal with a smart grid. How much are they willing to interact? And that's a really important question, because if we build what we believe is a utility that the customer wants, we're probably going to miss that mark. So we brought people in and found out how they wanted to interact. And we started putting the customer in charge and started to have them make decisions on how we were going to build this smart grid. So we have 15,000 people connected into a smart grid infrastructure in Worcester right now. And it's been a great petri dish for us to look at. Rather than doing it in some ways where you go out and establish all the smart meters and do that to, you know, we have 5 million electric customers in National Grid. By the time we finish deploying that technology, it's probably outdated. And we've learned a lot just doing it with 15,000. So our call to action, I missed a slide. The integrated blueprint, what we really need to do is to build that resilient backbone. We've talked a lot about climate change. You know, building a resilient backbone, if we built an infrastructure that was able to withstand Hurricane Sandy, we wouldn't be able to afford our electricity. Because if you think about what it takes to withstand a hurricane, it's a huge investment for that very infrequent event. So how do we build a resilient network that when it goes down, we can bring up critical infrastructure quickly? How do we partner with the cities to find out what they want to have re-energized? And how do we help with the microgrids? How do we have that cogen that we can fire up as the utility and get the essential services up in a city as we continue to restore? How do we think about, like, the home or the business, the rehab center, Spalding, when they put their transformer on the top of the building? How do we do that for the right infrastructure? How do we do it for the right places that we know we can keep the essential services going in the communities? So that's about resiliency. And I think when we managed the electric for LIPA on Long Island and managed our own gas system on Long Island during Hurricane Sandy, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about the type of things that would have made such a difference to the communities there. So with that, we've been building plans. We've worked with the grid modernization docket with the DPU. We've been working with REV, Reforming the Energy Vision in New York, and we've been looking at how do we take these learnings from those two regulatory dockets and make a difference for the communities when the storms hit. And with today's pending storm, we've done weather modeling. which is something very unique. We actually worked with MIT and developed weather models. So yesterday, the weather models told us that we should have 65 crews come into our area to support us for what we believe are the potential events that we're going to see in Massachusetts. So we'll take that, and after this event that goes through, it'll gather all the data from this event, and we'll be able to make it smarter for the next one. So right now, we're putting crews in specific places based on weather bug data in schools. We put in these little weather bugs, or help support put in additional weather bugs, which are places that measure pressure and wind speeds and all the different pieces of information. So after this event, we're going to be smarter next time. So we can't build it to sustain Sandy, but how do we make it better for the customers we have in our region? How do we bring it back quicker? And how do we have people in the right places even before it hits? So those are the types of things we're thinking about today to try and make it better for everyone else as these events continue to come.
Thank you. One more presenter, and then they are all yours. Again, all five will come up to the stage. Our next presenter brings more than 20 years of experience serving many of the leading North American and European insurers, reinsurers, and insurance brokers. She is currently Director of Insurance Programs at CERES. Please welcome Cynthia McHale. There she is. Hi, Cynthia.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you all for having me here today. Just for those of you who don't know CERES, we are a Boston-based not-for-profit organization, or otherwise known as an NGO, advocating for sustainable business practices and climate and clean energy. Our insurance program is central to that. We know that mobilizing the U.S. insurance industry is critical to our nation's understanding of climate change impacts and investments for the future. So with that, I'd like to just share sort of 6 general observations in my travels related to reducing local costs and risks of climate change. So the first is the current situation. Where are we today? There is a large and expanding gap between total and insured losses from weather catastrophes. Got lots of great graphs to show this over the past 30 years. But what we're seeing here is that both insured losses as well as total economic losses due to weather catastrophes have been trending upwards. Huge losses are being absorbed by our federal government, by our state governments, by our local governments, as well as by individuals through damages to their homes or loss of jobs, as well as to local economies. On average, since 1980, the private sector insurers have paid about half of direct annual losses in the U.S. from catastrophic weather events. So that's about 50% is being picked up by private insurers. The public is picking up that other 50%. So there's a huge amount there that lands on all of our backs. Note that direct damages, though, are only really a small portion of losses when something happens, a natural catastrophe. They have very long-term indirect costs for all of us. For example, loss of revenue, disruptions in supply chains, and price increases for many of the goods that we use every single day. The second observation I'd like to bring your attention to is that climate risks, which for eastern Massachusetts certainly include sea level rise, altered hurricane intensity, heat waves, and as we've talked a lot about this morning, intense precipitation, are forecasted to significantly increase in losses. These are costs, translating that into costs. There have been at least 200 weather-related natural catastrophes annually in North America in recent years, compared to about 50 per year on average in the 1980s. So as the frequency and severity of these extreme weather events intensify due to the effects of climate change, The federal and state disaster relief and insurance programs will become increasingly unsustainable. The costs will be too great to bear. Although certain areas of the country are more exposed to specific climate perils than others, no part of our country is immune to the economic damages and disruptions caused by climate impacts. Perhaps the most well-documented effect, certainly, of climate change, and one that poses a significant risk to our U.S. coastlines from Florida to Maine, the Gulf Coast, and all along the Pacific coast, are sea level rise. Furthermore, the Atlantic coast from Massachusetts to North Carolina is a hot spot for sea level rise. So the third point I'd like to impress upon folks here, one that we don't always think as much about, is that incremental changes in weather patterns also impact localities, balance sheets, and require solutions. For example, I grew up in Rockport, Massachusetts. That is a tourist community. When there are fewer sunny days, fewer people come to the beach. I now live in Western Massachusetts. We have a lot of local agriculture. When there's not enough rain, the crops don't do very well. So minor variations that don't seem that extreme to a lot of us can have a big effect on local economies. So in addition to these high-profile natural catastrophe events, huge variety of increasingly volatile weather activity, such as changes in temperature and levels of wind, rainfall, snowfall, and even the amount of sunshine, which can significantly impact the balance sheets of local governments and businesses, even if these only constitute minor deviations from the mean. The weather doesn't necessarily have to be extreme in order to have a negative impact. Sometimes it's merely just uncommon weather. I don't know if you recall, a couple of years back, we had a lot of snow right around Halloween. I know that my children, and perhaps many of the children in your families, were very disappointed that they couldn't go out and trick or treat. Yet, despite the increasing amount of evidence, many businesses, municipalities, and governments are either failing or not doing nearly enough to identify the links between variations in climate conditions and their own revenue streams, or indeed to protect themselves against the considerable risks such scenarios present. Okay, so the fourth general observation. In defining plans for strengthening resiliency to climate change, it's critical to anchor the development of those strategies in the best possible understanding of the magnitude and the types of risks facing localities, including their infrastructure and neighborhoods. So while certainly we appreciate that to some extent it's impossible to quantify future risks, the insurance industry, in fact, and this is one of the areas that we're really pressing on the sector to lead, they have developed a lot of probabilistic models. They have access to a lot of data and information. And they also have a lot of analytical techniques that can help us all to understand some of the risks and the costs that we're facing. For example, New York City engaged Swiss Re following the impact of Hurricane Sandy to assess both the frequency and severity of an event such as a coastal storm on New York City in the year 2050. So working with the city, the company applied the same models used to their internal underwriting and risk analysis activities to assess the risks facing New York. They estimated in an average year today in New York City, the costs of extreme weather events are $1.7 billion. In 2050, that cost in today's dollars will be $4.4 billion per year on average. That's roughly equally attributable, 50% of that increase to sea level rise, the other 50% to increase in storm intensity or hurricane storm intensity. And that assumes the city as it exists today, so no more resilient, but also no greater concentration of buildings and property. Fifth point here, prevention and adaptation strategies must be the first priority in order to reduce the extent of economic loss. We know that the reality is $1 invested in resiliency saves $4 in terms of rebuilding. The need for solutions that prevent and reduce damages from extreme weather events is great. One type of solution, for example, is the work done by the Institute for Building and Home Safety, IBHS, which does scientific research on structural design and construction to make commercial and residential buildings stronger. Currently, federal disaster assistance funds are primarily directed towards recovery and repair, with a relatively strong amount expressly allocated to prevention. Tying at least some portion of disaster relief appropriations to rebuilding to higher levels of specifications is critical. Moreover, if states were to use a percentage of their federal disaster assistance funds to take steps to prevent and reduce damages from natural catastrophes, that will alleviate some of the pressure on our federal government. And the sixth key point here to make is that towns and cities cannot control the climate, but they certainly can reduce the financial impact. Local governments should seek to balance resiliency investments and the transfer of residual climate risks, that amount that you cannot protect yourself from, to the insurance market, such that the means to rebuild post-disaster are readily available. It's also critical to do that to maintain the very insurability of homes and municipal buildings and infrastructure. If it no longer is insurable, you are holding all of the risk on your own books. So the sort of goals would be to reduce the gap between total and insured losses, reduce the financial burden for local governments after an event, decrease the volatility to local budgets and improve planning certainty, and enable immediate access to funds to cover the cost of disaster relief and fast-track rebuilding efforts. The speed with which you can get an economy back up and running is critical to its longer-term viability. So adequate insurance coverage for both privately owned property, homes, and businesses, as well as municipal exposures, is again critical. Options for municipalities include some of the more novel types of products, such as parametric insurance, which essentially kicks in after a defined event occurs. There's no loss adjustment. Let's say, for example, wind speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour. That insurance policy kicks in, there's an assumption there's going to be damage and need to repair. Coverage is available for single and multiple weather perils and is becoming increasingly innovative. So just in conclusion, just to recap some key points here for state and local planners. Assess future climate and weather variability risks and invest in resiliency, examining a broad portfolio of options including both green and gray solutions. 2, when making resiliency investments, certainly seek to combine strategies that both improve resiliency as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's critical. Sometimes we can think of one or the other. We really need to combine investments or investments that combine both of those objectives. Promote and enforce stronger risk reduction policies and practices with regard to land use planning. I know these are hard decisions, but building codes and promotion of renewable energy and energy efficiency, these will help ensure future availability and affordability of insurance and risk transfer products. And last, promote adequate insurance coverage for both individuals and businesses, as well as consider a range of weather and catastrophe insurance products. So, yes, sir.
CERES, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what that is.
Oh, CERES, yeah, what does CERES stand for? Great question. It's actually no longer an acronym, but it did at one point. We started 25 years ago following the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and a group of investors came together. We now direct the Investor Network on Climate Risk, 110 institutional investors. But CERES at one point stood for CERES, was the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Enterprises. Yeah, we've been around. Mindy Luber is our president, and many of you in the room probably know Mindy. So thank you, good question. Great.